sharing some perspectives with you today with regards to mobility development. And this is something that for many people, especially coming into the program, is one of their key goals. So I think it's very important, firstly, to establish quite a textbook definition of what is mobility. Leading on from that, some added perspectives of my approach and how I see mobility and how I see it as something useful for a movement practice. And then getting into more of the specific types of approaches and types of tools that we use in order to develop that mobility. First of all, in order to think about a textbook definition of mobility, we also have to take into consideration the idea of flexibility. So as perhaps many of you already know, flexibility is essentially the range in which a joint can be moved through. So what does that basically mean? It means basically that, for example, I might be able to hold my foot up here like this, and then when I let go, it falls here. So you can think of type of an active and passive range. So the flexibility would be more of the passive range that the joint could move through. And when we start to think about mobility, we're starting to think more about the active range. So the perspective that I like to use with this, the concept is the idea of moving and being moved. For example, if I'm using a pancake, so this is my pancake, I have my straddle, I can bring myself towards the floor. But in actual fact, I'm also being moved by the force of gravity in conjunction with a hard place, which is the floor. Whereas if I were to try and emulate this idea from sitting and try and actively pull my legs up, I don't quite reach the range that I'm able to when I'm being moved. So normally the range of moving is less than the range of being moved. This perspective is something else I speak about with regards to other things, but it is enough to kind of solidify that idea for now. One of the things you have to think about quite significantly with developing mobility is also its connection with strength. And in many cases, the line starts to blur between mobility, strength, and even prehabilitation. Because in many cases in prehabilitation type movements, we are strengthening and stabilizing joints in a particular range. Stabilizing in itself could also be seen as a type of strengthening. And of course, then once we start increasing that range, it starts to blend into mobility. So it's never really cut and dry, and depending upon you, your movement past, your restrictions, your types of mobility and prehabilitation will be different from other people's. Likewise, over time, there are things that you perhaps were previously using in your prehabilitation training that would extend and increase in their form and start to be used for mobility type movements. Such as, for example, working from a Peterson step up, which is focused really on just the end range extension of the knee, working on the VMO, the muscle here, which plays a huge role in stabilizing the knee. And then working to things like split squats or even sissy squats, which have a different perspective on the stress of the VMO. Now, thinking about strength in connection with mobility, we can then determine that mobility is essentially strength applied through a range. When we're strengthening your ranges, they may be ranges that you have that are existing. However, your mobility work might also take you where it's necessary and most common for most people into the area where you're then extending that range. So let's think about this again. We have a definition of mobility as strength through the range in which a muscle can pass through. However, in some cases, people are able to pass quite flexibly through certain ranges. However, they don't have strength to actually use that range. So again, some of the tools that we use might be slightly different for different people because whereas some people are really trying to dig out further end ranges, other people are really not, and they're just trying to strengthen the ranges that they currently have. Bringing this now to the perspective of how I see mobility in connection with a movement perspective, it's the idea of usability and ultimately movability. So what do these words mean now? So basically usability is, can you actually use your muscle through that range in a particular movement pattern? So for example, if you have a beautiful split, you have a nice middle splits position here, but I can't really move in this position. I can most definitely, if I'm working through the floor, I can pass through it this way. However, for example, I can't really stand from this position. For me personally, the position that I actually have strength is probably then here. Here, I can actually move in and out of this position, I can come down, I can enter it. However, in all reality, that end range doesn't really have the information in it. It doesn't have the experience to produce a contraction in that position. So then we must ask ourselves the question, how useful is that position, other than for an Instagram picture or something on Facebook, in developing you as a mover and being able to move through space through the ranges that you have. So this is the perspective that I take on mobility and mobility development, which is why the majority of the movements we use in order to develop your mobility are dynamic movements. So in some cases, you might even look at your program and think, it looks like I'm not even working on my splits or anything like this. These things are always being worked on. Whether you recognize it directly or not, they are always being worked on. It just depends in some cases if a person does particularly have a really deep yearning to achieve the middle splits or front splits. It's not my position to then say, hey, do you really think this goal is useful for you? No, I will support you fully up until a particular point, but then it does get to a point where I might ask you the question, okay, what do you need this for? If you're a dancer and you work with aesthetic forms, of course, something like a splits is very, very useful to you. On the other hand, if you just have a static splits form and you work in martial arts with a lot of kicking, it may not necessarily benefit you, because there's also then another type of mobility that you need, which is ballistic mobility, and this again requires different tools. So just to think more specifically about the types of approaches that we use in order to develop mobility, and my perspective on how you actually develop that essentially a bit quicker and with a more sustainable approach, basically meaning that over time you still have the range, not that you get a head to toe at one point in your life and you think, okay, I got it, I hit it, and then the next week you're one fist away again. Why does this happen? Well, essentially the perspective I want to share with you is one called allowances, which basically means that your body is going to give you or allow you what you ask of it. And the thing is, this is very readily associated by many people to the reductive concept of the SEDS principle. The SEDS principle is specific adaptation to imposed demand. It's so commonly thrown around, one of these things, you just adapt to what you do, that in the end people don't actually do it. Simple as that. So allowances is basically a perspective that incorporates the idea of you have to ask for something. You have to ask of this range from your body. And in regards to the time and things it actually takes to develop, it's also important to take into consideration, how long have you not asked of this from your body? So let's think of some ways that we can ask of these ranges from our bodies. One of the most obvious ones that we use are specific routines and protocols and exercises that are designed to target those particular areas, such as working with a squat routine in order to develop your passive squat position, such as your low gait routine in order to develop the availability and the understanding of moving through the low gait position, such as the loaded progressive stretching type movements we use, your Jefferson curls, split squats, and these other variations, as well as the ballistic type of movements we have, along with static movements as well. These are very deliberate attempts to help increase and strengthen the ranges that you have. However, if you were to cumulatively add up the time under tension that is spent in your actual practice sessions, asking that of your movements, it's not actually a lot of asking. It's less asking, and it's more shouting and demanding for a shorter space of time. And it's necessary for many people who are quite restricted to use what I call the bullying approach. And there's a trade-off with this, because the bullying approach, first of all, it goes straight into your nervous system, which is why many people in the first instances can get really great developments with it. Because essentially, one of the things that I didn't mention in the first instance, but is hugely important, is the relationship of the nervous system in giving you allowances. So when I say we're asking for allowances from the body, what I'm really saying is, first of all, is not the physiological allowances. It's not that I'm actually asking, certain fibers to change in their makeup in order that the tendons in themselves actually have more range in them. What we're dealing with, first of all, is the allowance of your nervous system. Now, your nervous system is there to protect the body ultimately when it comes to the ranges. And the strength that you have, in your leg, if you didn't have an active nervous system, you'd essentially be able to kick your leg off your body. There wouldn't be like an antagonist response to hold your leg into position. So it's there to protect you. However, of course, just like many parents, they can be very overprotective if not minded in a particular way, if not encouraged to see something from a different point of view. And the other point of view that we're trying to share with our nervous system is, no, I am safe in this position. I have control in this position. And now, in order to tell your nervous system this, again, it requires time and information spent in that position. So this is quite simply the methods, the classical type of PNF methods, when you're using things like contract and relax, stretching. And this is, again, has a dual-edged, it's like a double-sided sword, because in the short term, you can use like a PNF type or a contract and relax, and you squeeze it and you relax and I have this range. And you squeeze it and you relax, oh my God. And you press it, next thing your stomach's to the floor and you think, oh my God, I've got the pancake and it's available to me. And then you try it again the next day and you start from here again. This is not available for you. For a range to be truly available for you, you should be able to step off the airplane after a 12-hour flight and pancake flat, or do whatever it is. And then this is the huge difference and the real journey between simply achieving a range and owning a range. Achieving a range and owning a range. So achieving a range is when you've kind of tricked your nervous system enough to giving you the allowance that it's relaxed and, okay, I can go here. Owning a range is when your nervous system has it already built into its system. Now, I don't even monitor that part because I know that this person is safer there because they can control it through muscular contraction. How do you get to this point? Well, there's some good news and some other good news, because it both includes practice, and practice is always good news. The good news is that when you work through these loaded type stretches that really bully your nervous system into truly giving you the range you have, then you truly know, okay, I have this by physiological definition. Like my physiological range will allow me this once my nervous system is slightly overcome. The other good news is that it takes even more practice than it does to get you to that initial point of finding the end of your nervous system range. It takes even further practice to then extend that physiological range more so than it does the neurological range. So this is the good news, that it will take even more time and practice to extend your range than it will to simply give you the range that you already had, but you perhaps weren't neurologically aware of. It's all practice. Moving on to then think about how, if I'm saying that the tools and the routines and the protocols we use in your routines are perhaps not enough time under tension, not enough asking of your nervous system to develop that sustainable, long-lasting range, then what do you do? Well, essentially, and this comes to the crux of what I want to share in this video, is that what is programmed on your piece of paper should never be the culmination of your entire practice. I expect you to have other things that you have happening in the background, not just in terms of whether you're doing a different discipline or whether there's some other type of practice, physical practice that you have. But also, if one of your goals is long-lasting mobility, I expect you to be spending time in these positions outside of your programming. Because I will share with you one of the most effective, long-lasting, sustainable ways to develop a range and mobility in that range is by using it. Not just in your routines, by using it on a daily basis. There's a reason why I'm in this position now, even though it's available to me speaking to you like this, and there's a reason why if I change, I'll change to another position that helps maintain a range, and then I'll move to another position that helps maintain a range, rather than choosing positions that are not demanding so much from me, such as just sitting with my legs straight on the floor. It's because in order to be given the allowance that you're asking for, you have to ask for it in such a way that's sensitive but consistent. Sensitive but consistent. So what does this mean? It basically means if you want a squat, if you don't even have your passive squat, take every opportunity to be in the passive squat. Take every opportunity, and this should go down to changing your environment in such a way that it facilitates you to use the squat. So in some cases, this can mean, if you own a lazy boy chair, throw out the lazy boy chair. Something that's not as extreme as that. Spend some time squatting if you watch TV or if you're doing work or things like this. Do your thing until it gets uncomfortable and just sit on the floor. Sit on the floor with your back just against the sofa, looking at the TV. Constantly change your position. And this is something that I've called floor culture, which requires you to cultivate in your own time, in your own house, in your own practice. You're required to culture floor culture in order that it gives you the certain ranges that you're asking for. There's a separate video on this in relation to home office, so you can refer to that as well. However, if you're looking for a pancake, you should constantly sit in a pancake in a straddle position whenever possible. This is your new waiting position. In the initial instances, it will have to be very, very deliberate. You will have to consciously think, okay, I better get up and sit in the straddle position because this is the one that's really difficult for me. But after time, they will become available sitting positions, and they will become the sitting positions that you use. Likewise, when developing things such as the wrists and the fingers, even the toes and the ankles, when developing these ranges, the practice should be that when you're sitting around, you should find yourself constantly stretching the fingers, constantly checking the shoulders, constantly checking the ranges, retracting the scapula, playing with the shoulders, working open chain movements in space. Whatever it is, you should constantly be moving, constantly essentially be practicing something. And this is something that if you want to develop truly lasting and serving sustainable ranges throughout your body, something that's not just a party trick that you say, oh yeah, last year I used to be able to get head to toe and then I stopped and I can't get it. Well, you never got it in the first place. Something like developing consistent head to toe is, for example, a project I've been working on for the past couple years, in which it requires something consistent and small every day. You can achieve a head to toe in a matter of months. to own a head to toe, something completely different. And likewise with the pancake, likewise with the middle front splits, likewise with things like bridging. So the things I want you to take away today from this video, the first thing was the definition of mobility, the textbook definition that we gave, which is in relation to comparison to flexibility. So flexibility is the passive range in which a joint can move through. Mobility was how that you can move through that joint with strength, and we use the idea of moving and being moved. The second thing we looked at was my perspective of mobility in relation to a movement practice, which is the usability and movability of the joint through that range. So we're thinking more about passing through ranges rather than just static positions. The next thing we thought about was the idea of the nervous system. We touched on that in relation to giving allowances and developing something that's actually sustainable. And the last part we looked at is how the varying methods we use help contribute towards that, and my emphasis on if you are really looking to create a sustainable long-term range in your body, like the passive squat, like the pancake, all these things, that it must be used on a daily basis. The cumulative time under tension and time spent in these positions should not simply be in the minutes, and over the week it should be towards the hours. In order to do this, you need to develop a floor culture in your life, which was the subject of a different video that I'll link. But also it basically means you just spend more time on the floor, use different sitting positions, prioritize the ones that are more important to you. And over time, and by time, I'm talking months and years, more likely, the years, that you will see these changes happen. But if you're really determined that you want to have these ranges, this really shouldn't be any problem for you. I mean, a practice is not months, a practice is years, a practice is a lifetime.